It's good to have everybody here, but I want to get started because I want to give this as much time and as attention as we possibly can. So for everybody that's here, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure most people that are here are from Vancouver, but not all. I noticed Liza's here from Toronto, which is great, and we've got some people from other markets as well. So anyway, obviously June 15th is coming up really quick, like tomorrow, okay? And there's been some changes. So the Real Estate Council of British Columbia has made some changes, and because we sort of specialize in Canadian real estate, I thought it'd be a great opportunity to talk to Tony, first of all, and I'll talk about why we have Tony, but just talk about what's going on, and hopefully that what we can do is we can bring you as much information as we possibly can so that you can move forward with the new changes, so you're not going to make any mistakes, get yourself in maybe a little bit of trouble, but also so you can prosper in this market, because always with change comes opportunity. Sometimes it's hard to find. We got to really look for it, but we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the changes, but we also want to talk about the opportunities that lie within these changes. So first of all, we have Mr. Tony Joe here today, and Tony is a wonderful human being. Tony, how long have you been coming to our events? I don't know.
2002 was the first one.
2002, wow. So 16 years. So it's good to have Tony here. Tony is more than a client. He's a friend. He's also been a part of our coaching program. He's now a coach with us as well. And that is really not what qualifies him to speak about what he's about to speak about today. So I'm going to let Tony share with you why he is sort of qualified to talk about this subject. So take it away for a moment, Tony.
Well, first of all, I've been doing this now since 1991, so I've been at it for 27 years. I got to say, Rich, I wish I bumped into RRI a lot sooner than 2002. It's a whole other story altogether. I have a team here in Victoria. I was the president of the real estate board in 2008. One of my team members right now, Kyle Kerr, is the current president of the real estate board. So even as a team, we're very active in organized real estate, not only here in Victoria, but provincially and nationally too. I spent a lot of time at the committee level, both locally and provincially, and I do some work for the Korea International Committee. But the context of today and the reason why we're here is that I'm one of the instructors for BCREA. So many of the people who I see on the chat here have been in one of my classes. I teach the new licensees on the island here, both in Victoria and Nanaimo. I teach professional development courses in the province, so I've been all over BC. And as an instructor, of course, we spent a lot of time together, actually, talking about these new rules, face to face with council. So I've been at this hard on for probably the last 3 weeks. Yeah. And we had advanced notice not only of the course, which everyone's going to need to take, but also the forums and conversations face to face with council members. So, yeah, been having a good time.
Well, you've been busy, I know that. And one reason that I must compliment you is the amount of time that you spend working to try to, let's say, raise the level of professionalism in real estate. You spend a lot of time doing that. And you also spend a lot of time in your community. So it's really cool stuff. So we're excited to have you here today. Now, BC operates a little bit different than many of the other provinces. So in other words, if I look at the Toronto Real Estate Board in Toronto, they're pretty well self-governing to a point. You know what I mean? They make up a lot of the, their own rules sort of thing. Now, yes, we have government oversight, there's no question, but BC is a little bit different. So can you give everybody a little bit of background on that before we get into the changes?
Yeah, so I guess what brought this all about, everyone in BC knows, is that with the strong market, when things were escalating pretty well out of control, particularly in the lower mainland Vancouver areas, there were some bad practices happening. There was this whole shadow flipping that was going on, where licensees were selling a property, then selling the paper. It's a domino effect, happened many times. There was a lot of money being made, both by the agents and by the people who were selling the paper. At the end of the day, though, the initial consumer, so the first person that sold their home, ended up getting the low price, on that totem pole. So consumers started getting angry, brought this up with the politicians. The provincial government at the time was kind of laying low. But then all of a sudden, when we had our provincial association created a 28-point improvement strategy that the government didn't actually really have much time to look at, because the day after it was delivered, they took power away from our real estate council. So they dissolved the council. and they appointed a new superintendent of real estate. So there's been a lot of changes happening in the past year. The one of the big things, though, is we've only been self-governed, like, not long. It was only about I think it was about 7 years, 7 or 8 years. Yeah. So it's been a big change, but it all came about. It's largely political right now, right?
Yeah, sure it is. There's no question, right? I don't know if you know this, but one of the fastest laws passed in Canadian history was the no-call law.
Yeah.
And obviously, if anything is really popular with the public, the politicians are there very quickly, right? Yeah. And you and I both know that most realtors abide by the rules. They're professional. They do a very good job. And sometimes it's a few that ruin it for everybody else, right? And I think that's what was happening out there, especially with the shadow flipping as well as some other things. Okay, so let's get into the meat and potatoes here. So let's talk about the changes, and then we'll move into opportunities. So give us an overview of what's happening, and then we'll go more specific, say what happens if somebody comes to an open house, what happens if somebody wants to double end a house. We'll get more specific. Give us an overview, and then we're going to finish off with what are the opportunities with these changes.
Okay, so I'm hoping that all of our BCers who are watching this right now have gone through the knowledge base. So BCREA has created a website that has all of the forms, it has videos, it's got instructions and everything. The bottom line, though, is there's a lot of paper now. There's a lot more paper now than we ever had to deal with before. Right. In particular, the disclosure of expected remuneration. We will need to give our seller a form that has the exact dollar amount of what our brokerage fee will be on offers and counter offers as well too. So you look at a situation where there's multiple offers, we have to prepare that a whole bunch of times. Viewers may not know, it's coming out hopefully the end of this month, I think, but Council is creating an app. No, I'm sorry, I'm going to take that back. I'm thinking about something else. There are other apps, though, that are spreadsheets that will help you with calculation because, of course, realtors are not necessarily good at math. But my first suggestion to you guys would be to make sure that you have a calculator that helps you on the fly with commission amounts.
So in other words, what's happening here is every time an offer comes in, you got to disclose the dollar amount, not the percentage, right, of the commission. And then when there's an offer comes back, is that presented to the buyer as well or just the seller?
The disclosure of remuneration, it's to your client, basically. Right?
So just the seller. And every time it comes back, then what's going to happen is you have to redisclose what that dollar amount is.
Correct. Here, you're going to have to be very careful because imagine what happens if you send your seller's counter offer to the buyer and you've worked out the percentage amount, right? And what if the buyer comes back with their counter, which is higher, that the seller subsequently accepts? So you're going to want to make sure that you have another disclosure of remuneration showing the new amount, because if they accepted a higher amount, the last trail of paperwork was the lower counter offer, then you as the licensee and the brokerage could be on the hook. So that's a really big tip that we've taken away recently.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay, so that's one. We got a lot more paperwork, but there's also paperwork involved. So, okay, so somebody calls in. It's an ad call, sign call, whatever it happens to be. Take us through that process.
All right, so the main thing is we can give general information on the property they're calling about. So obviously, how many bedrooms, square footage, maybe schools nearby, how much the taxes are and things like that. The biggest change now is we cannot start the conversation about their qualifications, their financial position, their motivation, their needs to move. Because the minute we start talking about that, we have to stop the conversation and we have to send them a disclosure of representation and trading services. That's basically the working with a realtor brochure that all the provinces have, right? So the working with a realtor brochure has been changed. It's now called the disclosure of representation and trading services. We literally have to stop the conversation, send it over to them so there's a record that it was sent. The interesting thing is they don't need to sign it. Signing is only optional, but we need to have that paper trail that we had the conversation with them about agency and what our role is in the conversation.
Right. So let's think about that for a moment. So a call comes in, somebody's inquiring, and we'll get into dual agency in a minute. Somebody's inquiring. You could be on the phone talking to them. And you could have the disclosure, you've got it stored in your computer, Dropbox, or whatever the case is, right? And you could say, you know, for me to continue the conversation, I do have to send you something, right? Which requires you to get an email address.
Yeah.
So you get the email address, and then you're going to send it. Now, let's face reality here.
Yes.
Most people, they're going to go, no, I get everything I need. I just want to know about the house.
Yeah.
So the challenge here is it's taking away your ability to generate a lead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so your conversion is taken away. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be complicated to turn that incoming phone call into a buyer of another property.
Okay. So let's talk about that's an incoming call. And you know, and realistically, it's not like you're going to say, just a minute. Now I want some information from you. But before I get information from you, I got to send you this form. They're going to go, no, 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 no. Like, I didn't want to give you any information, right? Because before, you know, sales was asking questions, right? Then they ask you a question, you answer the question, you ask them a question. Okay, so then let's think about an open house. Same deal with an open house.
Yes, indeed. Now, mind you, if somebody walks into an open house and announces that they are in an agency relationship with another agent,
right?
Pretty cut and dry, because then you just let them go. They have general information about the house. You tell them about it. You are not going to try to convert them anyways because they belong to another agent, right?
Okay. Yeah. So then we got sign calls, we get ad calls. You could meet somebody in the street, ask about a listing down. Like anytime you have a communication with somebody, we're disclosing information about a listing. Yeah. Basically, if you start to ask them questions about themselves, it could be implied agency.
Yeah, and okay, another example, because we're going down this path right now, is you're at a cocktail party or you're at some sort of business networking event. Right. And of course, everyone talks to the realtor and says, hey, how's it going? What's the market doing? You know, tell me about the house down the street. Do you think that's a good price?
Right.
And we literally will now have to say, I'm sorry, we can't talk about that right now. Happy to meet with you at my office and have a conversation. If in fact, you know, is it small talk or is this information that you're really requiring? And if so, we have to go through this process. That really starts with
this is a weird example, Tony, but let's say this. Let's say I'm at a cocktail party and I have a piece of paper in my back pocket. Okay. This happens to be that form, right?
Yeah.
And I say, hey, Tony, here, will you take that, put that in your pocket. Now let's continue, right? Yeah. Is it that simple?
Okay, well, I was mentioning a few moments ago an app that's coming out at the end of the month. Right. And what the app actually is from Counsel, and it will enable you to pull up the disclosure form on your phone. Right. So when you're having that conversation with somebody on the fly, you can show them the form, and they can also acknowledge it by signing their name on your form. So that is coming up. That'll help us out.
Okay, good.
Oh, but it changes the tempo of the conversation because we have to stop. Right?
Like, you know, my estimation as you know, somebody that coaches and trains real estate agents, I think it's insane. Like I'm just going like this is literally insane. Like why don't they do this with cars and vacuum cleaners and everything else, right? If you really think about it.
Yeah.
Right? It's
well,
really
you know, we've had conversations with the legal industry. So the lawyers all say this is how they've been practicing for years.
Yeah.
You know, you're at a cocktail party, somebody asks a legal question. They have to, they got to make sure there's no conflict. So any advice they gave is not in conflict. And the other thing is if they give advice, they're liable for it, even if there isn't a signed agreement. So that's basically what Counsel wants us to do. They're turning us more into lawyers away from the sales process, right? Okay,
so that's disclosure. We've talked about disclosure of remuneration, okay? We've talked about when you first meet somebody, the conversations you can and can't have. Now, by the way, everybody watching this, if you have questions, type them in. We're going to get to your questions. Some people might say, well, how long this is going to be? This is going to be as long as it needs to be, because I just want to make sure that we can get as much information as we can get to you that will be helpful to you. That's my whole goal here, right? Okay, so let's talk about the dual agency, okay, and implied agency. Okay, so explain the deal there, because that's changing everything a little bit anyway.
All right, so limited dual agency. So the act of representing both the seller and the buyer in a limited basis impartially that we've had since day one, basically, that is now banned. So that is not available. There is an exemption, and it is in tiny markets where it is what they say impracticable for the consumer to find another agent. So that would be like in a community that has maybe 1 or 2 agents where everybody knows everyone, right? But in the rest of the province, which I can't remember what the number is, it's something like 96% of the rest of the province does not qualify for that. So really, in short, limited dual agency is off the table.
Now, they have identified those markets already, Tony?
No, they haven't actually. It's going to be a sort of testing process because it's going to require the brokerage to send an application through to council to get the approval. So even that's going to be a clunky situation. Right? It's slowed the deal down. So in a small marketplace, if they can't find an agent and it's a deal that needs to be negotiated right away, they're going to have to stop and go through this application process through council. Right?
Okay, so let's talk.
It's sounding great, isn't it?
Yeah, it sounded good so far. So, so let's talk about. You go on. You've got an open house. Somebody comes in. They want to make an offer on that house.
Yes.
This could put you. Well, it does. It puts you in a dual agency situation, right?
Yeah. So if you ensure that you have not started an implied agency situation, so you haven't had conversation with a buyer about their personal information, their motivation, their financial capability, you can still double end the deal, but only if the buyer is what's called an unrepresented buyer.
Right.
There is a form that is the disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties. You will basically have to say to the consumer, listen, I work for the seller. Anything that you say can be used against you. So in fact, don't tell me anything about your personal background, because if it even comes out, I am obligated to tell my client, the seller, there's a form that explains the risks. You know, you're coming here without an agent. Actually, strangely, they don't need to sign that one as well, too. It's optional. But there is a full form that, and the word danger is there, the risks, right? The risks of unrepresented buyers. So you can still sell that open house. Yeah. It has been suggested, though, that is going to be a very dangerous proposition for licensees. And we all know that council is looking for their first cases of contraventions, and I would not want to be one of the first cases there, because it's going to be.
I would agree. Like, to me, based on what's going on and how sensitive this is all going to be for a little while, right? I wouldn't even do it personally. That would be just my play. So let's just stay out of this. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen then is, chances are they want to buy that house, and let's say they want representation, or you're not willing to work with an unrepresented buyer. What do they do? What's your suggestion in terms of the recommendation you should make to them?
Okay, so the first thing is, I may not want to work with an unrepresented buyer. They also need to agree to, so they may not agree to that arrangement.
Right.
If that's the case, the easiest thing is for them to go find their own representation.
Right.
What a lot of other agents are working out right now is a referral situation. So, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you've come into our home. I'm the listing agent. I work solely for the seller. I cannot represent you. I can't give you any advice. If you don't have an agent, I can recommend to you 3 names of other good agents in my brokerage, and they can help you.
Okay, which is great, because could you get a referral from that?
You most certainly can. Now, mind you, if you've made arrangements with those realtors on a referral basis, and there is a 25% referral or whatever the amount's going to be, you will need to disclose that to the consumer. So again, it's disclosure. And you do that on the disclosure of remuneration form, which we've had in BC for years.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So now let's say this. Let's say somebody walks into that house and they want to buy the house, and you happen to know them. You know them from university, high school, that sort of thing, and they're willing to work as being unrepresented. What happens?
Yeah. That's going to be a very difficult one to argue in court, because if you both agreed to unrepresented party and something happened badly with that transaction there, are you going to be able to prove to a judge in court that you had 100% responsibility, you had 100% fiduciary duty to the seller, and you gave nothing to the buyer? If you know their history, you know, there's a couple of litmus tests. You know, if you've socialized with them, if you've gone out with them, if you traveled with them, all of those things, it's really tricky. The hairy part of what you're suggesting, though, Richard, is if you know these people, maybe even have transacted with them before. So let's say, you know, you sold them a house 15 years ago or something, right? You would then, because you are potentially in an implied agency situation,
right,
you would need to potentially, well, you need to recuse yourself from that buyer.
Right.
by saying, I can't help you because I'm representing the seller, right? But the trick is both the seller and that buyer need to agree to the recusal, right? And if they don't agree, you potentially, as the listing agent, may need to step away from the listing as well as the buyer. It requires approval from both parties.
What about teams?
Same story, you know, because the team functions as if they were one person, right?
But not the brokerage.
No. So there is the other part. There is wording in the listing agreement, and I'm hoping that all of our BC realtors have gone to the BCREA page on RealtorLink, because all of the new forms are there. So the contract of purchase and sale, the multiple listing agreement, the buyer agency exclusive contract, all the new versions are there. So you should review them. There is a notation in the listing agreement that states that if the recusal process is entered into, the buyer does not have the opportunity to turn down the situation if it's within the owned brokerage. So if I referred somebody, the brokerage of course owns the paperwork, right? They own the listing, so they can redesignate somebody within the brokerage without the buyer's consent or non-consent.
So basically, it's like this: within a brokerage, one agent could be the listing agent, another agent could be the buyer's agent. That's all okay.
Mm-hmm.
However, on a team, it's not okay.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. So if we go back years, technically, the broker was the agent, right?
Yeah.
But they're saying now that that's okay. It can happen within a brokerage, but it can't happen within the team.
Within the team.
Okay. Okay. So let's see if I missed anything here. Disclosure of referrals. We talked about that, correct?
Yeah. So there's something else I want to bring up too, because there's been so much conversation about with teams. Do we disband the team?
Right.
We have to refer out. What is that going to look like? Again, the key there is you need to disclose the referral by way of the disclosure of remuneration form to the consumer. The consumer needs to know that you're getting a percentage by referring them, right? But a lot of people, myself included, our thought process is we're gonna tee up with other similar production, similar producing teams or agents within our brokerage. And if this situation arises, we're just going to pass them over to that agent without expecting anything. Because me personally, I don't want to have that attachment of the money.
Right.
Right. And the other part too is that it would require me disclosing to that consumer. Right.
Right.
Now, if we are reciprocating with an agent that produces a similar amount to us, the idea, of course, is that they would reciprocate when the same situation happens to them.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. I like that idea a lot. I like that. Okay, so in terms of the changes, have I missed anything here that we should be discussing before we get into some of the solutions and some of the questions online?
The biggest thing, what we've been talking about so far, it sounds gruesome. And honestly, Richard, it is. It's not good, right? But for us as professionals, especially within our organization, RRI, we need to look at the opportunity. So how can we take these situations that we've been forced into here and turn them into positives, right?
Agreed.
So one of the big things I want to review with you is the situation of listing appointments, right? So what happens at a listing appointment? We go, we have a look at the client's home, we break the ice, we do the marketing, and we normally talk about the CMA. We do that, at the house, right? Okay, so the problem now is that we cannot start talking about the evaluation of their home until we have discussed the disclosure of representation and trading services.
Right.
So there's a hard stop right there, right?
Okay.
The one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is, Rich, you always talked about the double barrel shotgun approach, right? You used to always talk about you either do the marketing plan or you do the evaluation, right? They're two separate items, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now, how this will look is that you would go and you would do your, your marketing plan. You do your listing presentation and hope you guys have a really strong, powerful listing presentation. And at that point, you would have to stop the conversation and basically say, listen, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I cannot get into talking about pricing your home, because if I do, it puts us in an agency relationship situation. And if for some reason you choose not to hire me, then the difficulty is I'm never going to be able to bring you a buyer.
Right.
Because I've already had this conversation with you about price. So you're going to have that hard stop and determine where your relationship is at that moment with the seller.
Let me ask another question. So how, and I know there's no line in the sand to when this does or does not happen, but when it comes to implied agency, if I take a phone call and I say to somebody, I'm curious, where do you live? Is that a question that would cause implied agency? Or does it have to be a little deeper? Like, so where are you moving to? You know, how much you're putting down? Have you been qualified? You know, that sort of thing.
So to ask a consumer, where do they live right now? Yeah, that would be going down the path of agency. Yes. Any personal information. So the litmus test is general information, and it's basically any information that they can find online, generally on realtor.ca. That's all the information you can give them before going down the path of agency. Okay, so I got some questions, and then I want to go to opportunities, okay? So you can probably see these, Tony, can you? Yep. Ann Chow's question. Yes. Do a pre-listing appointment tomorrow. Disclosure of representation in trading services need to be signed before I ask any questions of a potential seller. Yes. So actually, we just went through that, Ann. You can talk about your marketing plan. You can present, you know, your listing presentation. But before you start talking about personal information with the seller, you will need to produce the representation of trading services. Absolutely. So really what you can do is you can present all the information. The way it boils down is I can present anything about me, right? I can talk about my track record, all those sort of things. But what I can't do is I can't talk about anything that will have an effect on them in terms of pricing their particular property. Where are you moving to? All those sort of things, right? Because that's where I'm creating an applied relationship right there. Yeah. You know, the biggest change is consumers. The general consumer mindset is they want to hire a listing agent because they think that the listing agent has buyers that they can bring to their home. That's been the consumer mindset since day one, right? Right. And the biggest change right now in the province of British Columbia is consumers will start to understand that that is not the listing agent's role anymore, because they can't do that. They can't bring their own buyers. Right. They can't bring buyers from their own database, because it's just a bad thing, because now they can't be saying, you know, you don't get the listing, we'll bring me a buyer, right? Exactly. Get into that. Okay. So let me see here. Gary, as a listing agent, when the seller sends back a counteroffer, should the expected remuneration form be signed? So should a remuneration form be presented with a counter? Again, that's best practice, right? Especially if, as I said earlier on, if the counter offer is accepted at a higher price than the seller's counter the buyer was, the commission will be different, right? So you've got to make sure that the seller is aware of the very end bottom line, what they're going to be, before they sign the offer. Yeah. Okay. Mark says unrepresented buyer is a minefield. Couldn't agree more. If the seller has given you authority to disclose their motivation for selling, can you share with buyers? That's Gary's question. You know what? That's a question that has existed out there since day one. And the answer there is yes. And additionally to that, as all of us instructors of BCRA say, make sure you have that in writing. Yeah. So you need any directions or instructions in writing from your seller. Yeah, really important. I think taking good notes is a good idea when you're talking to people. You mentioned that. Terry says, I think what I'm hearing, both the buyer and list agent need to include an updated disclosure of remuneration with every offer and counter offer. And the answer is yes. And you know, we've talked about this at the brokerage level and at the instructors level. You got to think about the amount of paperwork. There's going to be a lot more paper just in the disclosure of expected remuneration. It's going to be. Deb, yes, is changing to dollar amount, not a commission amount, not a percentage. Yeah, it's a calculation, is not just a percentage. Yeah. Elizabeth says, and I'm just reading those, I haven't pre-read those. So if I write something in a Schedule A of a listing contract and also in realtor remarks stating that if a buyer agent did not initially introduce the property as a buyer, then 25% referral fee will be paid to the listing agent. Okay. So Elizabeth, we actually see that a little bit in Victoria. I think in other marketplaces too, where it says that if the buyer was not introduced to the property, then the selling commission is reduced from whatever it is down to $1,000 or something. Right. Yeah. I mean, people do that. I'm not necessarily in agreement with that. It feels kind of anti-competitive to me, but yeah, again, that is something I think that is up to the listing agent as far as what their business plan is, right?
Terry says, are the new forms loaded on web forms?
They are not yet. Terry, you will find them in RealtorLink. You've got to go to the BCREA site, and there's an entire page there of all of the new forms. As of today, they are labeled sample. So here's a copy of the contract of purchase and sale right here. This is the new version. Of course, it will not be available until tomorrow. But actually, while I have this out, what I want to show you guys, you may not be familiar with this. This is the new page. I know it's going to be hard to see. This is the disclosure page. So this is where we need to explain the acknowledgments of the fact that they have read the disclosure representation of trading services, and the buyer acknowledges having read it. There's a lot of acknowledgement happening here. So there's a whole there's a new page now in the contract of purchase and sale.
Okay. Maureen, the answer to yours is, can I sell the house? The answer would be no, correct, Tony? And Maureen's question?
Let me find this.
How does it affect CMAs? I'm in competition for listing. I don't get it. Can I sell that house?
No, and that's what we brought up a moment ago. So if you had the conversation with the seller about value and how much you think the property is worth, and you know their motivation, the reason why they're moving and all that, you cannot bring a buyer to their house anymore. You have to recuse yourself from that situation. Right. Yeah. Yeah, okay. Which as you said a moment ago, Rich, this is something that sellers will need to know, and that is, hey, listen, if you don't hire me and you feel that I'm the person that might affect a sale for you here, the one thing I will not be able to do, I won't be able to bring buyers to you afterwards if you choose another agent.
Right.
Which is kind of weird because you can't bring buyers anyways because you can't limit a dual agency, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay, Michaela says, one thing that was mentioned at my office meeting yesterday was that you can't use the conflict of interest form unless both parties are a client at the time.
Correct.
There's a buyer represented by another realtor that you worked with, for example, 10 years ago, and they're in your social circle. Is your understanding that we can use the conflict of interest form?
Yeah, I get that, Michaela. So the general discussion is your agency responsibilities end with the transaction. However, your requirement to hold confidential information lasts forever, right? So I guess the question is, in that particular case, how much confidential information do you have that would be relevant to the transaction at that moment?
Right. And it's one of those things you've got to be able to really, if you're going to do anything like that, boy, you better be prepared to prove it to court.
Yeah, lots of notes. Talk to your managing broker. Make sure they have they've been taking notes as well too. It's going to be a tricky situation.
Yeah. Actually, Patty's comment is good. Realtors no longer sell real estate. We only represent a client. Our mindset has to radically change. That's actually, I think that's very close to being true, right?
Yeah. And you know what? I think this will affect change in that we've already seen there are people leaving the business right now because they're not able to adapt to the mindset. And
have you seen teams disband, or have you heard about teams disbanding?
I have heard about teams disbanding. I had conversation with a very busy team recently who has planned to create a buyer division and a seller division.
Yeah.
But I brought up a couple of things to her, and one of them is obviously you can't share a database. So it would have to mean they would have to have a separate database for their buyers and a separate database for their sellers, right? But then what happens, as it commonly does, where your seller becomes a buyer?
Yeah.
Right. So there's gonna be crossover. I think that's gonna be a very murky situation. Yeah. I don't think it's practical.
Yeah. Okay, just a couple more questions, and then I want to get to the opportunities here. So, Maureen, existing clients, good question. Do we have to go back and complete the disclosure?
No, everything starts as of tomorrow.
Okay.
So all the old forms are grandfathered. But actually, we have produced a couple of videos that we're sending out to our clients explaining this because when you think about it, this is kind of moving into opportunities, Rich. But This is another great opportunity for us as professionals to engage in our clientele, because it's our job to give them, keep them updated on all things real estate, remind them that we are their trusted professional. They're reading about this in the news. It makes a lot of sense for us to send things out to our database and say, this is what's happening.
It's touch too. It's a great way to bring value, help them understand, and they see you as a professional, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, it says, Leslie said, I use a program called Market Snapshot with top producers that sends out houses that are listed and sold in their neighborhood. Am I still able to send this out monthly?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That is MLS data. The thing about Market Snapshot in BC, though, is it does include sales history, which Realtor.ca does not do. That's one, yeah, I've thought about that. We'll have to clarify that. It's a third party. Those of us who use Market Snapshot know that it's not like we are personally translating the information or sending it out. It's all automated through the data exchange, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, Brad said, Maureen's questions. Can we not end agency?
So again, your agency relationship ends with the transaction, right? But your duty of confidentiality does not, right? When you think back, Brad, to there's always a conversation about, can you downgrade a consumer? You know, in the old days, it was, if they're a client right now, can we turn them into a customer because of the fact that it's a limited dual agency situation or whatever? We've never been able to downgrade the relationship because we already know too much information.
Right.
We can't say that we don't know things, right? So the quick answer to the question is going to be no on a downgrade, right? But again, our agency obligations end with the transaction, but our confidentiality does not.
Does not. Okay. How's it going to be policed? Complaint driven? Do you have any idea?
Mm-hmm. It will be complaint driven. We asked that question of counsel, actually. And I guess it's really going to end up being generally complaints from consumers or agents. So, when you think about it, the managing brokers are also going to want to be really on top of the situation, because no managing broker I know is going to want to be the first one taken to counsel, right?
Okay, so if we've been working with a buyer looking for a home already, and we have the old working with a realtor brochure signed, do we still need to have the new one signed? The answer is no, right?
Yeah, so the answer is no, Shella, because all forms are grandfathered. However, I would suggest to you it's probably a good practice to actually go through the new forms with them.
Right.
You know, there's a lot of information. It does make things very clear to people. So I would suggest that you do it anyways, but it's not required.
You know, David said something, watch for spy phone calls and emails, and I do believe you might see a little bit of that going on, especially for maybe the first year, right?
Well, counsel has been asked if they're going to do that, and they're not saying yes or no.
Right.
The question is counsel going to be setting up a sting operation, right? So the encouraging news there is it isn't yes, they are doing it. It's a maybe. Who knows? But you know what? We should be conducting ourselves in the correct way all the time anyways, right?
I agree. Okay, so Tony, thank you, sir. What I want to do, this is, by the way, these are Tony's notes that he sent to me, okay, to get ready for this. Very thorough guy, and I appreciate him taking the time to do this. And what he put on here, he said opportunities to our members, okay, or opportunities, really, we can say the real estate industry. So I'm just going to start it, and you can finish it, Tony. So the first is buyer agency, which I do believe is a great opportunity. So go ahead with that.
Okay, so let's face it. I think consumers are going to start getting frustrated with this process because they're going to be going through open houses. They'll be making phone calls. They're going to be stonewalled by agents saying, I can't give you information, got to stop, got to send you this form. Consumers will start understanding that, hey, you know what, maybe it's a good idea to have a buyer agent. So I would suggest that any of you guys who've been thinking about doing it should start really strengthening up your buyer agency skills. Make sure you have a strong buyer presentation. Some of you have taken my buyer agency course. I've done it on the island and actually in the interior quite a bit. I can bring it to the lower mainland as well too. Buyer agency is going to be very, very important. Oh, by the way, I'm in a course right now as we speak next door. And I was chatting with a licensee from Salt Spring Island, and we had a fight, actually. because we disagree. And he said to me, he goes, well, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to sign everyone up unrepresented so that when they're in my car, we're not going to talk about anything other than just general information. That way I'm not putting myself in a bad position. Yeah. And I said, what is that? What's the conversation in the car going to be like? Yeah. Not only that, you know, what kind of service are you providing the consumer? You're not providing them anything, right? You know, they might as well be in a Tesla autopilot just driving around, right?
Yeah, right. Because, you know, they could easily start, you don't have to ask them. They could just start telling you information to put you in an applied relationship, right?
Absolutely.
Like that's all it takes, them to mention a couple of things to you and it's happened, right? Yep. Which means, well, we know what it means. Okay.
So buyer agency, crucially important. And you know what? I've been teaching it for years. It elevates our profession. It just makes us so much more professional when we have formal agreements in place.
Like hey, the way I look at it is this. I look at it and say, yeah, I was just over in Malta. So I was in Malta, right, about 2 weeks ago. I was over there speaking. Now, there's no MLS system over there, no licensing. So it's a wild, wild west, right? And I can show you a picture I took on my phone when I was out for a walk. And there was 5 real estate signs on one listing. It was an open listing. So what happens is they all go list the house, right? But whoever sells it gets paid. Nobody else gets paid. Well, buyers in the past have been open buyers. They could be working with 5 agents. Whoever sells them house get paid. Well, that's disorganized real estate. What's happened here in Canada and the U.S. for that matter is we have organized real estate, and you know, licensing, and then boards, and then of course continuing education credits and things like that have brought a higher level of professionalism to our industry. And at one time you didn't list listings. No. Now you do. Well, really, in all fairness, the same thing should be happening with a buyer. And in all fairness, why on earth would a buyer want to work with 2 agents? Other than the fact they might want to work with a listing agent because they think they're going to get a better deal on the house, right?
And now that's off the table.
Now that's off the table. So it makes sense that agents, the great opportunity right now with these changes is to be listing all buyers. I don't know if you call it listing, but sign them under buyer agency, right? All buyers. And then you've got an exclusive relationship. To do that, you're going to have a great value proposition, right? You better be able to do.
And the other thing too is if you're doing a correct buyer presentation and you're having a conversation with your buyer about the process and how things can work, you then have the opportunity to talk with them about what happens if you want to buy one of our team's listings, or what happens if you want to buy a house that another one of our buyers wants to look at. You get to have that conversation right there and then and get them prepared, as opposed to having that conversation at the moment. You know, at that moment when they find the house, it's too late, right? And that's when all the hardship will happen.
Yes. And then the other thing is listing presentations. And I sort of like this as well because you mentioned that that's another opportunity. So I'm going to let you explain it because it's your idea.
Yeah. Again, we've got to have a really strong listing presentation because now all of a sudden consumers will need to be choosing us based on our capabilities, based on our skills, our experience, our expertise, and not just based on the price we give them, because that has been a consumer habit since day one. We all know that most of the time a seller will say, well, you know, you say 700, but the other guy said 800, so I'm going with the other guy. So it's really separating our analysis of numbers from our level of expertise, right? And that's going to be tough for people that have the habit of buying listings. Let's face it, right?
100%. So now really what you could do is you do a whole presentation, and then you could say to them, do you feel comfortable? I'm qualified to get your home sold. And say, well, yes, I do. Say, well, would you like to go ahead and start it? And then they say, well, we need you to give us a price. Well, this is a beautiful thing because now you actually can't do that, right? Which means you say to them, well, if you're comfortable with me, you never list with an agent based on price anyway. You list with an agent based on being the best agent for the job. So, you know, obviously we can go ahead, we can start signing some of the paperwork, and then let you and I agree on a price.
Right? You know, there's other things that you might want to try to implement. For instance, suggest they get an appraisal. Right. You know, start talking to your friends in the appraisal industry and see if, you know, that's something else you can refer off. Because really there's going to be a separation with the seller about, here's what I can do for you. You know, you figure out the price. You know, we'll get a third party doing it. Because then we're not married to the price. Right.
100%. The other thing you wrote down here, and then we'll go back and get some of these other questions. And this is actually very important for everybody to understand. You said double ending under limited dual agency is low anyway. So it's really only about 5% of the market, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, it's funny. I was having this conversation with coaching alumni Cal Kaiser up in Duncan.
Right.
And Cal there, he does 25% limited dual agency. So he's going to be affected, right?
Yeah.
But he's taken on the attitude of, you know, okay, it's going to affect me, but I'm not going to lose 25%. Right. I'm going to lose 12.5%.
Right.
Because he still had the listing anyways. It's not like that business goes away, right? Yeah. And both his and my opinion is we can make up for that loss with more buyer agency contracts. We have more buyers under contract, right?
100%. Yeah. Love it. Okay, so that's good. And the other thing you put down here, it's going to increase the professionalism of the industry, which means the great agents will probably do better and the weak agents will have to leave.
Yeah.
Not a bad thing, right?
Yeah, we're forced to have the conversation because, you know, all the provinces have working with the realtor brochure. Yeah. And in British Columbia, we've had it. We all know we are supposed to have a conversation with the consumer about the working with the realtor brochure at the earliest convenience. Mm-hmm. But the reality is most licensees have only been pulling it out when it's time to write an offer or it's time to do a listing presentation. And that has got to change because the consumer needs to know. The consumer has the right to know what the process is. Mm-hmm. They're paying us a good dollar for being their agent. They have a right to know the process. They have a right to know how it's all going to work. Why resist this? I mean, it's what we have right now. I think we have the opportunity to get really strong at this and basically overpower the guys that will fight this, right?
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Okay, Amanda says, does the same go for PCS? So if you do a pricing adjustment.
I'm sorry, which PCS as in private client services, probably talking about automated, so we're talking automated listings when you're sending a client listing updates.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, of new listings.
Right.
Does it affect it? Well, you know, you are in an applied agency relationship. Right. You already are. If you're dealing with somebody right now, you know their personal information. I'd suggest to you it's probably a good idea to formalize that relationship and get that disclosure of representation and trading services done. So you're already in deep because you can't say you don't know their personal information. You know, actually, I want to bring up one thing that is a touchy subject, Rich, and that is online lead generation.
Right. Okay.
Right, because of course, a lot of agents pay for leads to come in, and the idea is for us to convert the leads to turn them into buyers elsewhere, right? Mm-hmm. And that's a tricky one too, because what counsel tells us is we still need to show the disclosure of representation and trading services before we start talking about personal information.
Mm-hmm. We all convert those leads, isn't it?
Yeah. But how is that going to be done? Maybe there's opportunities for us to maybe create like a landing page or somewhere that we direct that consumer to. Mm-hmm. That is a page full of great content and information where they have the opportunity to read that form and learn more about how you stand out relative to the rest of the agents out there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, good. That's actually a good point. So Rennie says, are we still able to offer members on the website information not on realtor.ca, right? Really, the answer is probably not supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Because you're already in implied agency situation, even if you don't have buyer agency signed up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Terry says, I think consumers are going to start asking, what exactly am I hiring you to do? And how does this affect your ability to market my home?
Well, that's a great question. That's a great question. And you know what? I think any of the RRI alumni or people online here, it's highlighting the importance of your unique selling proposition. From a listing standpoint, you know, Rich, you taught us 20 years ago, you know, comparing yourself, your days on market, your percentage to list the sale price, your success rate, all of those things are more important now than they ever have been, because those are the things that we can use to separate us from the others, right? Which again is the reason why we got to have that strong listing presentation.
And I like what Katrina said here. Says, I think once the wrinkles are ironed out, this is going to raise the bar in our professionalism. There's no question it's going to raise the bar. Like, you know, it's 100% going to raise the bar. It's going to make it a little bit more difficult in certain ways. But again, what we got to do is we got to find the opportunity in other ways. And I do think buyer agency is a huge opportunity.
Yeah.
I also think I like this idea of going on a listing presentation and having the consumer make a decision on the agent they're going to list with, not the price.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, it's forcing us to do a trial close halfway through.
Right.
And a lot of times we don't do that. You know, we just go through the whole process and we cross our fingers and hope, you know, at the end of our presentation that, oh, they want to sign up. Right now we have to ask the question. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just take this last one, Valerie. So would you need to present the disclosure of representing trading services form to anyone who I've met at a kiosk in the mall before I speak to them, since we usually drive into their motivation? And the answer is yes.
Yeah. And Valerie, there, you know, the practice that counsel is hoping that we take is that you meet that person at the kiosk, you limit your conversation to general information, and then you book an appointment to actually, a formal appointment to meet them at your office and go through a process. So develop a process where you can onboard a consumer. And that really is leading into a buyer presentation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Come into the office. I think that's going to be a big one coming up. The old CETO, right?
Yeah. Okay, what's Sue to say? An individual we know contacts us and emails us and tells us they're being transferred, and could we come over and chat about listing their home? If we do not get the listing, but we have the motivation, where do we stand? Well, you're an implied agency, which means technically you can't sell that house, right?
Yeah. I mean,
technically you can't sell that house.
Yeah, we literally have to stop consumers now. You know, when they start talking about moving from somewhere, we're going to have to say, I don't want to know. Please, before we formalize a professional relationship, you know, there's barriers here that we can't cross information-wise. Now, Sue, you know, you're bringing up the question about somebody emailing us. That's a tricky one, you know, because they're giving us information. We're not even having a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. It could be argued that we know too much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway, a little tricky right now. It's going to all wash out eventually, right? Because everybody will start to figure out the best way to do it. So first of all, somebody said, are we streaming this? No, but if you call the office, we could definitely get you a copy of this, because we are recording it. So we can definitely do that. You can call in the office. And also for those people, reminder is that July 4th and 5th, or it's 5th and 6th, right? 5th and 6th, we got our event coming up in Vancouver. Masters Academy. So if you're interested, go to our website and have a look at that. We'd love to have you there. And maybe everybody, if you don't mind, maybe give Tony a little thank you here, if you don't mind, because he's doing this on his own dime. He actually came in from a meeting or a course, just do this for 1 hour. So Tony, I really do appreciate it, because I know how busy you are, and I knew you'd be able to present this in a way that would help us all understand it, to a large degree, including me. Like, I've been watching it very closely, right? But you know, there's just so many different scenarios that you got to think it through. Where does this go? What can I do? What can I do? That sort of thing. So,
well, and you know, it's going to be relevant because the rest of the country, Ontario in particular, is going to be watching what happens in BC.
Yes.
Just like more in buyer tax, you know, they're going to shadow what's happening here. So I have no doubt that this may end up creeping over to the east, right?
I don't think I personally don't think there's any doubt. Obviously, we know everybody's watching closely. All the other provinces are watching closely, right? And I don't think there's any doubt that this is going to go right across Canada eventually, right? Mm-hmm. Because think about this. Here's the way I look at it. I go, and I've been saying for years and years and years that there's no way that a listing agent is going to be able to represent a buyer, right? It doesn't make any logical sense unless the buyer signs off, right? We get that. Because in most cases, you would never use the same lawyer.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's somewhat unprofessionalism. Now, I know that the consumer, and maybe this is where we got to play this up. I know that the consumer doesn't see always the value in having a relationship, right? The buyer doesn't see the value. I think the seller does a little bit more, but the buyer doesn't see that. So I think we've got to get better at communicating that value. And part of the value is, think about this. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you are buying the most valuable asset you've probably ever purchased. The most valuable asset. You deserve proper representation. Mm-hmm. you need to be properly represented, right? Because we've all heard of horror stories, you know, where the buyer has bought a house, discovered a number of things later, and maybe it's just the location. Maybe the location isn't as good as another location. And we can go on and on about what an agent would know, right, about a home, a location. I remember one time there was somebody died in the house, right, didn't get properly disclosed. Like, it was pretty crazy stuff. So I think what we have to do as an industry is, number one, it's raising our professionalism. Is it a little more difficult? Sure, but it's raising our professionalism. We've got to get better at what it is we do. I do think, on the other hand, we got to look at the buyers and sellers and say, is what's happening truly in the best interest of buyers and sellers? And I have to suggest it is. I have to say it is. I don't love it as a salesperson. You know what I mean? Like, sitting here as a salesperson, I want the easiest way to sell more homes, right? That's the way a lot of salespeople think. But I look at it and say, as an industry, our job is to continually raise their professionalism. And this here is definitely in the best interest of buyers and the best interest of sellers. So we can get upset about it, but as you said in the note you sent me, there's no sense resisting it. It's here, folks. It's happening tomorrow, right? And that's why I want to do this today, because I want to make sure that it was actually going to happen on the 15th, sort of thing. So we have to embrace it. And we have to talk to buyers, talk to sellers, look at best practices, find out what other agents are doing, how they're overcoming it, talk to other people. You know what I'm saying? All those sort of things so that we can get better at dealing in this situation.
You know, I often feel that we should be thankful that the government and the council has done this, because it is forcing the point that representation is important.
Yeah.
And up until this point, consumers have been feeling that there's an advantage going directly to the listing agent, getting the double end, and maybe, you know, getting a break in commissions. And that's where a lot of poorly practiced agents were benefiting, and they no longer will be able to. So I think it's up to us, as in all the people involved in RRI, all of the members, you know, all of the coaches, we are influencers, and I think it is an opportunity for us to influence the further professionalism of our industry.
Yeah, 100%. And Philip Hullett, he's not from BC, he's from Ontario, but he said, thanks, Tony, for the explanation. He's not from BC, but, you know, for Philip and anybody else watching from outside of BC, this is sort of good, because we can watch what's going to happen, because, you know, it's likely that it'll probably move right across Canada, right? And by the way, we got to give Mark here. Last comment is from Mark. I love this guy to death. Look, tomorrow the sun will rise in the east. Life will go on. Time to adapt and move forward. Mark, you're 100% right, buddy. You know, Mark is always the voice of reason. I hate that. You know what I mean? Anything's going on, Mark just comes out and says something. You're going, yeah, that's true. And that's why we love him. Thanks, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for being on with us. I hope this was helpful to you. And for all those people dealing in a bit of a different market, more good luck. But just at the end of the day, go out and do the best thing you can possibly do for the buyers, best thing for the sellers. Make sure you understand the rules, follow the rules, because it will serve the industry better long term. At the end of the day, it's just causing us to have to get better at what we do every day, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way I look at it. Nothing wrong at all. But thanks, Tony. I really appreciate you being here, buddy.
You're welcome. And thanks to everyone for being.
Talk to you all soon.